Welcome to this webinar on culture and the ethics of humanitarian negotiations. My name is Christoph Lidén, and together with Christina Rupsdorf, I lead a project on the ethics of humanitarian negotiations and mediation at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO. With us today we have Andrew Cunningham, who's an independent researcher and consultant. We have Ashley Jackson from the Center on Armed Groups, Paul Harvey and Nigel Timmins from Humanitarian Outcomes, Sulanya Maitra from the University College Dublin, and our one and only Aisha Bala Akal. Now, in our project, we look at the ethical dilemmas that humanitarian agencies face when negotiating with armed groups and states for access, for protection and programming. Today, we wanted to draw the notion of culture into this mix. And Christina, why would we want to do that?
Okay, thank you. So first of all, when we think about culture, there's maybe to state that there is a difficulty on defining culture, right? And if you're looking into the discipline that really deals with culture and has culture as a center, anthropology, they've had a big controversy about its meaning. So there's about, I think, at least 130 definitions around. However, when you look into it, they share some commonalities. And what it is it refers at its core to the ideas, customs, social behavior shared by groups or societies, or group of people. And it shapes their worldviews, norms. And this also manifests itself in habits, practices, and traditions, symbols. One could say that culture represents the deeply ingrained beliefs, behaviors, and maybe also unwritten rules that guide how people interact and make decisions. When you think about the iceberg model we often have, they're sometimes visible, sometimes not visible. But seeing that, when you understand how the role of culture for human beings, of course, it is very integral to negotiations as well. Yeah, because it shapes how people act, behave, interpret, make meaning, give meaning. And I think when it comes to negotiations and humanitarian negotiations, it does so on several levels. So first of all, there's a very pragmatic way of thinking about it, and maybe more on the skills level. So you could say, like, for an effective negotiations that happen oft cross-culture, right, with people from different backgrounds. So it's maybe the ability then also to adapt to different communication styles, to fit the cultural norms of the counterparts. But then on another level, it also shapes, as we said, the world views of the different stakeholders that participate in the negotiation, their norms and values. And that guides the bargaining, but also informs where they draw the red lines. It informs also moral decisions. Yeah. So in our research on ethical dilemmas and humanitarian negotiations, we do believe that questions of culture are central. Also, how people experience dilemmas, what kind of dilemmas come up, how they're being interpreted, and also what strategies are then developed in response to it. And despite this central role and awareness of culture, especially cultural differences in negotiation styles and all that, it has not received so much attention in scholarly debates, but also maybe in practitioners' approach to negotiations. So in this roundtable, we want to tap into your expertise and discuss it. And I would like to start giving the floor to you to introduce yourself properly. And maybe Andrew, could you say a few words about you and your background?
Sure. So I'm a mix of practitioner and academic. I've been in the aid business for over 30 years. I come from mostly from an MSF, Medicine Sans Frontier background. I've worked other organizations, but most of my career has been with MSF. I do academic stuff on the side, really, just out of intellectual interest. I'm not a professional academic. And my theme that I'm most interested in is authoritarian states, authoritarian practices, and the relationship between international humanitarian NGOs and states. That's my sort of research interest, which I carried over from my work in MSF.
And you just published an excellent book on that subject, which is to be highly recommended.
Exactly. Paul, could you introduce yourself?
So Paul Harvey, Humanitarian Outcomes, a small consultancy organization that does research on humanitarian stuff. And I've recently done some work looking at ethics and humanitarian action. By we, I mostly mean Nigel and Manisha. And out of initial work on ethical dilemmas in Afghanistan, developing a guidance tool that Nigel could say more about.
Sure. Nigel Simmons, Associate of Humanitarian Outcomes. I've been working in the humanitarian sector since about 1996. I guess with a number of INGOs, always in humanitarian situations. But I guess the organisation that sort of shaped a lot of my thinking is Oxfam. And then I've been consulting for the last couple of years. As Paul said, worked on this ethics guide, which I must admit I fell into. I do not consider myself an ethicist, but it's been hugely interesting, and worked with a number of groups on looking at how organisations handle internally their ethical dilemmas and how they discuss and try and resolve what's the best way forward.
Thank you, Nigel. And we have also Ashley Jackson with us. Ashley?
Christina, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm a co-director of the Centre on Armed Groups, which is an NGO that does research on and helps people to engage with armed groups. And we do that for purposes of humanitarian access, but also political dialogue, peace building, and so on. I started my career as an aid worker. Like Nigel, I worked at Oxfam and the Red Cross and the UN, and a lot of that influenced my later career in research in places like Afghanistan, where we were really grappling with how humanitarians can better engage with armed groups and how we can better understand them to pursue those aims. It's been a pleasure to be here. And back to you, Christina. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley. And last but not least, we have two contributors to our discussion today that are all more closely linked to the project, on the research project. We have Sulagna Maitra and Aisha Balakal. So Sulagna, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. It's great to be here. My name is Sulagna Maitra, and I am with the UCD Center for Humanitarian Action. So I'm based in Dublin, University College Dublin. And basically my research has been mostly on humanitarian action principles, and now, as it was said before, I also fell into ethics. I'm not an ethicist, but my interest has always been on interrogating the sociology of violence and conflict resolution and mediation. So, yeah, that's the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Sulagna. And Aisha?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm here based at Peace Research Institute Oslo, and I'm working as a research assistant under the project. And we have been predominantly working on certain, what you would say, problematic practices within the humanitarian action space that cause access restrictions. And I have a law background in international humanitarian law.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have plenty of expertise here, both very much from practice, but also some academic perspectives on the topic. And with no further ado, we go to the first question. Andrew, we would like to hear from you, from your research on humanitarian action more generally, but you also have worked on humanitarian negotiations more explicitly, especially with authoritarian counterparts. What role does culture play in humanitarian negotiations, in your view?
Thanks. The question is that I think, and I'll just give an example from a sort of an internal MSF debate over the years about whether culture should or not. So we have to actually start with the question, should it or not, and then move on to how does it. So, I mean, there has been somewhat of a polarized debate in MSF about whether it's necessary at all to look into the culture, to look into the history, or as any sort of deeper political analysis of the countries within which the organization works, or whether it's necessary to have a network and that sort of thing. And there has been a strong view by many, I think it's changing, but there's been a strong view that there's a generic way of implementing humanitarian action. And you don't need to know much about the place you're working, because you just, if the organization knows what it's doing, it's just you do what you do in the way that you do it, and you don't have to go out of your way to understand the context very deeply. That's not my view. My view is the opposite. I think it's necessary to have an understanding of the history and the culture, and have especially the political culture of a place. It makes the negotiations easier. It allows you to make fewer mistakes, I think, especially when you're negotiating. Because as Christina, you mentioned, that's if we say the culture has part of culture are the unwritten rules. Unwritten rules often come out in ways of behavior, but then also in discourse. So you have to be able to interpret properly what people are telling you, and interpret how they are behaving and how they're communicating with you. There's a lot of information there, and that needs to be interpreted. And if you're negotiating with a partner and you don't understand those things, then it's really difficult. You're just making a lot of assumptions about what the other side is thinking, based on a very superficial interpretation of the language that's being used and the ways of behavior. So culture, I think, is just it seems logical to me that that's necessary. It's necessary to have a better understanding of the culture of a place. Each place is different. I mean, every country is different, and different within countries. Different parts of the regions of a country are different, and it does take some effort to understand the culture.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a follow-up question, and maybe like very good points, and I think you draw a very good picture of the role of culture there. You also worked on Afghanistan, right? And maybe can you give us an example from your work on Afghanistan, where that illustrates this?
Yeah. So I did work in Afghanistan, in the field in Afghanistan, as implementing medical programs, and about 20 years ago. But then very recently, I did some as part of a broader research project within MSF, looking at the relationship between the organization and countries which implement authoritarian practices. One of the case studies was Afghanistan, looking at the Taliban as an authoritarian regime. One thing I want to flip the question around, though, because one of the interesting findings, I went through our old files from the old MSF files from the to look at how the organization engaged with and interacted with the Taliban then. And that was also when I was starting to work at the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was working in Afghanistan myself. And to compare that era with the current era. And the interesting part is it's much less that the Taliban have changed, or the Afghanistan as a place have changed. What the major cultural change has been is in the humanitarian actors. We had, in the late 1990s, there was a very similar sort of context, especially about the Taliban's relationship with women, and not just the Taliban in the northern areas and the non-Taliban northern areas. Very, very conservative. There are many issues that the organization faced around amputations of hands of thieves, and a lot of issues around child mortality and maternal mortality based on the policies of the Taliban and other non-state armed actors. Didn't make that much of a big deal about it at the time. It was something that had to be managed, but there wasn't a moral or ethical there was a medical ethical reactions to issues, but there wasn't an overriding moral sort of response. These were the constraints that needed to be managed in order to implement the medical programming that the organization wanted to do. That's much different than now. There is a strong reaction in the international community in general and humanitarian actors, which is much stronger and much more based on moral aspects, I think, of how a rejection of the Taliban and the policies. So I think the culture has changed on the side of especially Western culture and what we value and what we think is acceptable and absolutely not acceptable. That's changed on that side, which I think is an interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very interesting to turn it around like that. And Ashley and Paul, you've both worked on the case of Afghanistan as well. Ashley, you've followed it for a long time. How does this resonate with you?
I think in Afghanistan, there's a mismatch of negotiating cultures, as there is in a lot of humanitarian contexts. IP actually did these really great series of papers about each country's negotiating culture. They did one in Afghanistan, they did one on the US. This was many years ago. But I remember going back to that, and it explains a lot of the mismatch that has happened in Afghanistan. I think in general, negotiations are deeply transactional, for the most part, right? And there isn't as much investment in personalities and in kind of mutual reciprocity and certain principles that are found in Afghan kind of political and other negotiating culture. It's often a formality, I think, that humanitarians now, speaking to Andrew's point about how things have changed, how humanitarians now things under much greater scrutiny as well. So they have to report to donors. They don't have the room to be more flexible, to focus on relationships. But I think what we've seen in Afghanistan, what actually works is that you invest in people, you invest in these relationships, you invest in trusting them to deliver or backing off when they can't and coming back at a later stage. But the way humanitarians operate in Afghanistan is not that. There is not this trust. There's not this ability to see beyond the next. Everything is very reactive, again, very transactional and very public, right? Because you have donors breathing down your neck, you have social media, you have sort of journalism in a way that you did not in the 1990s. Do you think the Taliban has changed? I think arguably much more flexible at the local level. Some flexibility in the 1990s, which was met with more flexibility from some NGOs that could kind of work quietly and discreetly. Taliban itself is now a much more diverse of actors. It's inherited a state apparatus. It has all of these kinds of features that it didn't back in the 1990s when they were roughly uneducated, disorganized, had no idea what aid agencies really were, because again, a lot of them weren't really operating in the country. A lot of them were in Pakistan, the border areas. Yeah, I think we still face this kind of mismatch of cultures that really means that you have an international kind of donors that are responding to domestic concerns, don't really know what they want out of Afghanistan, but are keen to kind of use it for political posturing, right? They're quick to tweet, they're quick to talk about women's rights, they're quick to do all of these things. And then humanitarians have to deal with the consequences of these donor interests in a way that they didn't before, because of the way that media and things have changed. So I think there are a couple of dimensions in terms of what's changed and that kind of cultures. But on the upside, the one thing I would say is that now you have NGOs, especially the more solidarity NGOs, the Swedish committees, the Norwegian Afghanistan committees, and some of the more kind of multi-mandate NGOs have been working in Afghanistan for 20, 25 years, right? So they really do know the country. They do know people. They have more familiarity with how to get things done. They're just under much greater pressure to perform from kind of external audiences as well.
Yeah, and Paul, you've also focused explicitly on ethical dilemmas in the engagements with the Taliban after their takeover. Maybe you could then comment on the impacts of culture on these ethical dilemmas.
I was actually going to start in Sierra Leone with a more personal story. I said, when you started introducing the subject, I was saying, what do I think about negotiations and culture? And one of my sort of early negotiations as a embarrassingly young country director in Sierra Leone was as the international humanitarian aid agencies had just been sort of agreeing joint operating principles, which are certainly a restatement of humanitarian principles. And as the war shifted, we were able to get back to Lunsa, which is a town about 3 hours drive out of Freetown, where we could try and reopen a health clinic. So we drove out, meaning sort of me and the Sierra Leonean health manager that was a colleague, to try and negotiate with the armed parties controlling Lunsa to reopen the clinic. And that negotiation was with Colonel Deshwad, which I never knew his real name, because he was about a 17-year-old member of the RUF who, we met in a marijuana-filled room with even younger sort of fellow members of his armed group to present the joint operating principles and negotiate whether or not Children's Aid Direct could come back and reopen the health clinic. And clearly, culture is, all over that negotiation, his culture, my culture, what language it was taking place in. And so, it's an odd question to ask in a way, isn't it? So, culture is clearly utterly central to all negotiations, everywhere. And the sort of humanitarian principles that I was trying to explain to Colonel Deshwad in Sierra Leone and the basis of how international humanitarian actors try and negotiate access and permissions to work in different places, including Afghanistan, are fundamentally about perceptions. They're about whether or not local actors and armed groups perceive the work of international humanitarian actors as neutral, independent, impartial, and therefore whether or not they give you permission to operate. And so, negotiations about those things are fundamentally about perceptions and about trust, and therefore about culture. It's about how we perceive each other. And certainly in Afghanistan, trust is in short supply in all sorts of dimensions. Clearly, trust of the Taliban, of the motives and motivations of international humanitarian actors is in very short supply. But also, interestingly, when we were doing this ethical dilemmas work, trust between different international humanitarian actors was also in pretty short supply. There was a cultural clash going on sort of within and between agencies, and there was a real lack of sort of space for ethical disagreement. The negotiations within the international humanitarian system about how they should respond to the Taliban ban on female aid workers got pretty poisonous and unpleasant. And so part of the sort of motivation of developing, the ethical tool that grew out of the Afghanistan work was trying to create space for sort of dialogue about ethical dilemmas that could negotiate that. And so it's a slightly disconnected set of thoughts. The question on culture, I think, is not so much, is culture important? Because it obviously is. It's how could international humanitarian actors better sort of understand and navigate, the different cultural clashes that are going on, and what, how might sort of academic research help in that, I guess. And something I've started to wonder about in Afghanistan, also wondered about it in Myanmar, was there's a sort of assumption that the international humanitarian system is sort of homogenous and should be in agreement, and that its negotiations should be sort of coordinated. And that's just frequently impossible because it's made up of a lot of different organizations with different cultures and different views. And so, you get sort of slightly poisonous disagreement because everyone thinks we should have a united voice but don't. And And in Afghanistan and Myanmar, the last year, I've actually wondered if the sort of you should recognize the diversity of the international humanitarian system and use that to your advantage in negotiations. What the fracture in Afghanistan was in sense creating sort of scope for different approaches to respond in different ways to what's clearly a dilemma. So there's no right or wrong answer. And maybe that is okay. And we should let that diversity happen in sort of principle ethical ways.
Okay, and Nigel, you have been part of that study on Afghanistan, but you also summarized insights from these types of settings into a report called No Easy Choice, a humanitarian's guide to ethical principled decision-making that you've made together with Manish Thomas. And there you do address issues of religion and culture directly. So where does this land with you? And how did you think about the role of culture when you were working on that report?
Sure, thank you. I think also culture is obviously important because it might not be a formal way of defining culture, but in a way, culture is what's important to you, or important to the place where you come from, where you grew up, the sort of values that are deemed important. And I remember years ago, actually, just before I went to Afghanistan for the first time, which was in 1996, and I had a brief training on sort of culture things, and the terms that we use and have stuck with me is that from the West, we tend to come from a truth and guilt culture. So the truth is what matters. And if we do something wrong, we need to own up to it and feel guilty about it. Whereas in lots of cultures, Afghanistan, one of them, it's an honor and shame culture. The most important thing is actually your honor and status. And truth is a relative thing and kind of, is less significant than maintaining your status and honor. And those can be quite a fundamental clash that I think a lot of Western humanitarian workers don't necessarily think through or take on board or even know as much as they should. I think another clear cultural difference is individual rights and the value of the individual versus collective outcomes and what's best for the community. And again, a lot of particularly Western humanitarian workers place a lot of value on the individual rights, whereas other societies, other cultures are much more collectivist. And we see that most commonly in targeting debates and whether you target individuals or whether you sort of distribute aid equally. And I think another thing perhaps more particular to the humanitarian community is that we can often sort of see ourselves as more progressives, and a lot of sort of particularly rural communities tend to be more traditional. And again, there's a clash point there which I don't think we often give enough attention to or reflection on about how we come across. And I'm quite a fan of the old Red Cross Code of Conduct. And clause number 5 was we will respect the culture of where we're working. And somehow today the humanitarian principles are just those 4, and we've lost some of the richness that I think was in the Red Cross Code of Conduct. And actually, an organization I used to work for called Tier Fund, they used to have something called the operating principles. And I quite liked the way they approached culture, which was to say we will respect the culture in which we work, but we acknowledge all cultures, including our own, have faults and failures. And I think that again, that self-reflection that, we believe in individual human rights, that's a good thing, but there can be a downside, in our culture and how we approach things. And I certainly remember conversations in Afghanistan where people were, my wife in particular, who was working with groups of women in Afghanistan, they had all sorts of issues with how the Taliban were imposing rules on them. Of course they did. But they would challenge us back, and how do you handle your old people? You put your old people in homes until they die? What kind of people are you? And so it was interesting that, that element of reflecting on how we handle the vulnerable in our community, how we think about things, it can be different. So, and then the other thing I'd say about our culture, and I totally take Paul's point about organizations have different cultures. And I think there's quite a big difference between those organizations who see themselves as pragmatists and operational and those who see themselves as campaigners and fighting for change. That's a very different approach and infuses the culture, because those organizations or those branches of those organizations attract personality types the campaigning side of an organization tends to attract different types of people to the operational side, as they accrue their own internal cultures as well as the organizational culture. But humanitarians can often say, well, because we've got these principles of neutrality and impartiality, there can be a self-referential moral superiority. Oh, well, because I'm neutral and independent, I'm somehow better than you. You're partial. Partial is bad. Well, actually, there's this complete rubbish. We are, we may be impartial, but we're absolutely coming with an agenda. And I don't think we nearly enough reflect on that and take humility for that and recognize that we are engaging in a negotiation of values and cultures, and let's look for the common ground rather than a kind of yaboo, my values are better than your values. I've got universal human rights. You've got a funny religion, which only applies to some people. And that sense of superiority is, as I say, we need a whole bunch more humility and acknowledgement of what we're trying to achieve, I would say, in our negotiations. And just a final thought, if I may, Andrew, interesting your reflections. Just say my memory of the 1990s, and it is memory, so it's possibly, this needs to be checked out. But I wasn't working with Oxfam at the time, but I believe Oxfam actually suspended operations because of the restrictions Taliban put on women, and they did suspend. And I also remember there was an Italian politician who was head of DG Development, or ECHO, who came out and basically got herself deliberately arrested and thrown out of the country to make the point about how women were being treated. Again, from memory, part of the reason the Taliban, after they won control in Afghanistan in 1996, were not accepted as taking up the UN seat in New York, and they sent a delegation over, was because of how they were treating women and women's rights. And that, some would say that, it was because the Taliban were blocked from taking up their seat at the UN as the representatives of the Afghanistan government, was what then led them to establishing different relationships and different networks with others, right? Because at the time, what they wanted to do was basically be acknowledged, coming back to this honor and shame, acknowledged for who they were, respected for who they were. And when the West sort of basically said no, push off, that sent them in a different direction, and I think laid the seeds of distrust in many ways. Stop there. Thank you.
So, Paul, if there's no response to this, I think Nigel will take your memories as a very good, contribution to our discussion, reflections on this. And so far, I think we heard a lot about Afghanistan, but also Myanmar was mentioned. We know the culture also plays a role in other cases. And I think, Sulagna, you have worked on negotiations and humanitarian negotiations in the specific case of Bangladesh, right? In the Rohingya response in Cox's Bazar. And you had a focus on local perspectives on it. And also, and I think that is something that has been very much highlighted already in the discussion so far. When we think about culture, many would first associate, this kind of national culture with it, certain traits we ascribe to, let's say, national groups, with always the danger of essentializing, stereotyping, of course, right? But we also heard Andrew talking about political culture, looking at the humanitarian actors. We heard also in the other contributions references to the cultures of humanitarian organizations. And I think it's something that may speak to your research, and we would really like to hear your thoughts on this, Sulagna.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, it is indeed fascinating to hear about the cases in Afghanistan and also Myanmar. And of course, Nigel's memories. I think the panelists before me have brought in some of the nuances that we need to be mindful of in terms of negotiation and how they play out in the room. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that the Bangladesh case study that I'm working on as part of the research project, that is with you, of course, Christina, as the lead. So so it's very much a joint effort, and of course with everyone on the project. What I did want to focus on here was a shift a little bit from from the discussion of culture as in societal, a social, like, I suppose culture in a more societal sense to culture more in an organizational sense. And I think we found that this lens to be very helpful for the Bangladesh case study, and especially because we were looking at local actors. And I have to admit that we very much went into the case study trying to look for ethical dilemmas, very much from the perspective that it would be, to see the influence of religion or other moral values and how they kind of, as it was pointed out, quote unquote, clashed with the so-called neutral, impartial, humanitarian values. But what we found was quite different, and we found ourselves more and more leaning into the more public administration, organizational, cultural literature, and we found that to be a very helpful lens. And we also found that there was a lack of literature because even the studies previously that had looked into organizational culture had, especially in the case of Bangladesh, had actually looked at it from the lens of ethnicity, religion, education, and these kind of elements. So I just want to give a few anecdotes, and these are from the views shared very much by the stakeholders who were there. One was that in terms of perceptions of the locals, they very much saw the NGOs, especially the international NGOs that were operating there and the UN bodies, as something very akin to the big multinational corporations. So they kind of saw that culture as, similar to MNCs, only that in their daily operations, they were much more ethical. And so what you find is that a lot of people who were working in the corporate sector actually made that switch to the humanitarian sector, and they brought those practices, those outlooks with them. But the stakeholders also categorically kind of said that they did not experience moral dilemmas or ethical dilemmas that were necessarily related to their own worldview or moral compass or religion. And that could well be because this was a subculture within the Bangladeshi kind of national culture. So we are very much in one kind of, one space, which is not necessarily interacting with the so-called international world on a daily basis. So what you have is very much Bangladeshis, like people who are interacting with each other, very much belong to the same nationality, The other thing that we found is that in terms of culture, again, like I said, to contrast with the MNCs, it was the government, and then the government obviously had its own organizational culture and practices, which were coming from the more public sector, and then, of course, there were certain national specificities. And the clashes or the ethical dilemmas that kind of emerged were actually emerging from this difference in approach and difference in power and difference in what is, in terms of domain of operations. And there we see the same things that we would find anywhere in any part of the world, which is that organizations vying for agency space, and then the power struggle between the governments and the NGOs, etc. What I did find very interesting, and this is where actually we've been leaning a bit more into borrowing terms from public administration and other aspects, is more kind of looking at the vernacular culture and the more subaltern, because there were these almost not necessarily class, but very akin to class differences. And what we found that there was this difference between people who were working with international NGOs and more in kind of policy roles, and they seemed to restrict themselves to, or they were mostly based around the Cox's Bazar area, etc. And these tended to be kind of the more elite within the Bangladeshi education system, policy making, etc. And then we had so-called grassroots level workers who were going into the camps on a daily basis, and they typically were locals, for lack of a better term. They were the ones, and they were from maybe regional universities, spoke the local language, etc. And so there was very much like it was said before that, there's the humanitarian culture, which is sort of external, neutral, secular. And then there is the national or the local culture, which is the culture of the country. But when we zoom in a little bit, we find that the people who are operating or who are kind of the so-called elite and, educated in the best universities in the country, they sort of identify themselves very much with the global culture. And then what you have on the ground is more of a vernacular and a vernacular culture, and very much the subaltern who are the ones who, I think, when we look at humanitarian negotiation and support, we need to kind of look at, because they are the ones who don't seem to benefit from any of the trainings and any of the benefits of that the humanitarian sector gets from being this international integrated system. So I think that is something that is not often discussed, and that was quite eye-opening, and I think that would be an area to shed some light on. I think that's stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Solagna. So kind of with this zooming in, you show these nuances and differences, and that it's not so easy, right, to identify then the culture, right? And that people have multiple belongings, multiple loyalties. We worked also a bit with the concept of identities that might be more aligned with what you call the global humanitarian culture, that might be associated, with working for a certain organization and internalizing and practicing that organizational culture and professional culture as a humanitarian, right? What does it mean to be a humanitarian versus, like, let's say, a human rights activist or something, like this kind of professional culture, or like to be in a completely different sector, right? So we saw that these also played a role in there. And I think that is maybe on a different level, Aisha, what you also were looking at in your work on tacit engagement, and you refer also to the idea of a culture of silence that we kind of find in the humanitarian sector, in humanitarian organizations, and that affect the way we can speak about or actually know about ethical dilemmas in humanitarian negotiations, right? Aisha, would you share a bit of your insights on this topic and how you related to the discussion so far?
Thank you so much. I'll try to quite briefly talk about this conceptualization that we have been working on under the project that we think relates to organizational culture. And it is very useful for us with your really extensive field experience to hear if you think this is an accurate representation of what is actually happening. So this is very much a conceptualization in process of a phenomenon that we call tacit engagement. And we think that this phenomenon or this practice is actually reported extensively within the literature on humanitarian negotiations or humanitarian action in general, but in a rather fragmented manner. So what I mean by that is that we see most often different features of this phenomenon within the literature, mostly on remote management, risk management, localization, or more so faulty localization practices, and also the literature on sanctions and counterterrorism frameworks, among many other sources. And what this phenomenon is that we describe it as practices including secrecy and silence regarding the compromises and trade-offs made by frontline humanitarians to achieve access, protection, efficiency, and legitimacy. And so this is somewhat of just to simplify, a purposeful opacity on sensitive negotiations, but more so on sensitive trade-offs and compromises that frontline staff make. And this opacity or this silence is not just among organizations working within the same context, but also within different hierarchies of the same organization most often times. While the question of keeping silent or speaking out has been much debated, particularly within that strand of discussions around the principle of neutrality, this practice is a separate question from that. It is also different from the issue of confidentiality that is inherent in all humanitarian negotiations. And as I mentioned, there's a very vast literature that speaks to this practice without necessarily conceptualizing it as such. For example, there's a very recent paper that we came across that talks about humanitarian ignorance, the strategy within humanitarian organizations. We referenced and benefited from Dr. Jackson's work very extensively while working on this conceptualization, especially on her work on humanitarian negotiations with Al-Shabaab, particularly around that issue of silence and secrecy around tax demands that were levied at humanitarian organizations by Al-Shabaab, where every single organization that was working within Somalia pretty much knew that taxes were being paid, but no one wanted to openly address or talk about the issue or try to put up somewhat of a united front, because very understandably they were afraid of being singled out, particularly under these counterterrorism and sanctions restrictions. In our work, we build on such reports from the field, so we very much recognize the utility of this practice of tacit engagement, because the causes for this practice, they stem from a number of problematic practices within the current humanitarian paradigm. So this is not an exhaustive list, but to mention a few, we also did in our work. Like I said, counterterrorism and sanctions restrictions are a major cause. Donor pressure to deliver results, as Dr. Jackson mentioned, targeting practices that don't extend their security risk management to local actors, top-down localization, excessive administrative reporting requirements is another one. And then, of course, significant disparities in contextual knowledge between the headquarters and the field. And all of these are significant impediments for humanitarian actors. So this is most oftentimes a way of ad hoc risk management that frontline staff resort to be able to just merely stay on the field. So we're not trying to really problematize this practice or point a finger at frontline staff. To do that, we also, in our work, apply critical silence theory. So we question a lot of traditional understandings or Western Eurocentric understandings of silence, such as it being a passive practice or it being equated with a lack of agency. So like I said, we're not really trying to problematize this practice, but we do acknowledge the benefits and potential pitfalls of tacit engagement. So we're actually, even though the project is primarily about ethics, we're not trying to make an ethical judgment on tacit engagement, but we do try to, list a few potential pitfalls that this practice can result in. Just to, again, give you a few examples, we believe that this can lead to a difficulty of pushing back on demands by counterparts. We believe that this can, again, lead to a difficulty around establishing red lines within and across organizations that work within the same context. We think that this can potentially shift the burden of making such high-risk decisions solely on the shoulders of frontline staff who may not be, but are most often local actors who are not protected within in the same way as international staff. And then, this can also hinder accurate legal, reputational, and fiduciary oversight and risk management by the higher levels of the organization. None of these pitfalls necessarily outweigh the benefits of tacit engagement, but we argue that there's a need for collective reflection on this practice, and also more so the factors or the practices that lead to tacit engagement.
Thanks a lot, Aisha, and you speak directly to the question that sort of comes out of this, because we wanted to focus on negotiations in particular. So we have touched upon ethics in humanitarian action more in general and how culture comes into that. I wonder if any of you could speak to the question of, are there different cultures of negotiation as such, if we focus on the dynamics of negotiation? And I think Aisha already spoke directly to that in terms of the internal organizational cultures that humanitarian organizations might have when they enter negotiations. But it's also a question of the different ways of doing negotiations in the various settings of humanitarian action.
Yeah, if I may, that links into something I wanted to comment on anyway. And the reason I mentioned the change between the 90s and now within MSF, and that was mostly referring to MSF, because as Paul said, different organizations, there's a diverse range of reactions and thinking between organizations. But the interesting thing was that there has been a generational shift in MSF. The people who negotiated in the 90s and early 2000s in places like Afghanistan had a much different view over how to negotiate and what the culture of the organization was. This was being represented, and now, and that's a very interesting thing to me, because there is quite a clash between those like my age and people who are maybe 30 years younger who have a different view, because they have grown up in the world has changed, and so they have a different set of expectations. And one of the things that's most striking is that this, and somebody mentioned this before, definition or the identity of what the humanitarian organizations stand for. It's like within MSF, there are many more people who have, especially within the decolonization lens, who look at negotiations and look at the stance and the culture of the organization much differently, and want to bring in much more of a human rights perspective into the analysis and into the response by the organization. That does not fit well with people from my generation who then simply really differentiated between. So the organizations change, the culture of organizations change, and that really does affect how the. It's not that all the old people left, and then you have a whole collection of new people. You have a whole mix, and a continuum, which makes it a very dynamic discussion internally about how do we negotiate? Why, in what way do we represent ourselves, and what our identity is? What do we value, and what we don't value? That changes. That it becomes much more of a dynamic discussion within the organizations, which has to be sorted out before you start negotiating with the other actor, or else you just seem a little schizophrenic, because they don't understand what you are standing for.
Wonderful, thanks. So, can we say that there are different cultures of negotiation? And have you come across different cultures of negotiation in your work or in the literature? Anyone can speak to that?
All the time, even within my own organization. That's also something you learn very early as a humanitarian aid worker, right? Is that you have to navigate these different cultures of how things are negotiated, which takes deal of patience. And I actually don't think there's a lot of training for humanitarians on this. I think what I received early on, CRC, was about respecting different cultures. Actually, in relation to the code of conduct that Nigel mentioned earlier, the navigating different cultures, I think, is something that's been lacking. Of course, it's had more attention in recent years as you've had decolonization debates, as you've had the face of humanitarianism change and to have this more inclusive approach. But I think it's definitely something that is an essential skill that humanitarians need, but it isn't always acknowledged or supported in the way that it could be.
Yeah. Others want to come in? Solania, please.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate and to emphasize what Ashley said there, that first of all, yes, there are differences, and also just to this shocking lack of availability of training for people who, as Aisha pointed out, at the very coalface were taking or had to take these very high risk, sometimes, negotiation practices, but also had to do them for the survival of their own organizations. And this is where, in the Bangladesh context, you have a whole host of local NGOs who are actually absorbing these risks that are there, and they act as almost like a conduit between the international NGOs and the local government and all. And what we see there is that they are often left vulnerable to and Christina and myself, we had a bit of debate as to whether this was a vulnerability or this was an asset that was instrumentalized and then strategically used by the locals for survival. But that's a nuance probably for another day. But it is where actually culture is very much instrumentalized. So the common understanding of culture from ethnicity, religion, nationality, etc., I think that in fact was instrumentalized during intersectoral kind of negotiations, because that was the commonality. So while in mainstream humanitarian literature, we see that, okay, it's the international humanitarian culture and international humanitarian practitioners, and then you have the locals and, kind of this thing. Anecdotally, at least what we found was that in these negotiation scenarios or dilemma scenarios, local people, they actually see themselves as part of an organization, and then somebody might be from the government or the military, etc. And they see each other as very different. And then the local or the national culture, the ethnicity or the religious culture, like these elements of culture, they are instrumentalized to kind of win negotiation points, so that very often local humanitarian workers would be told that, yes, you're working on behalf of this humanitarian NGO, but you're a Bangladeshi first, so you should, do something more, work more for the Bangladeshis rather than, say, the Rohingya refugees, etc. So that was a very interesting dynamic that presented itself.
Thanks a lot, Solana. Coming towards the end, and maybe bring this back also to Christina's introduction on the very concept of culture. I think we've covered how culture is a term that can be used at many different levels. There's a very interesting article, or a very good, helpful outline of this issue in an article by Kevin Avrock from 2004 in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review on culture and humanitarian negotiations. We were quite surprised when we found it. I know his work on culture and conflict resolution, but he has written on humanitarian negotiations specifically. But in his approach, he emphasizes how you can define culture as relating to shared values, beliefs, and symbols of a social group, but where you need to remember that individuals can be part of several such entities, and within each social group there will be significant variation. And we've therefore also touched on, how it would be, very different to speak of a Norwegian representative of a humanitarian organization or of a multinational corporation, for instance. It will be acting very differently, thinking differently about themselves. So I think his conception of this, also relating it to elements of context in terms of, and people in humanitarian action always speak about context, in this and that context, sometimes in a very simplistic or reductive way, where kind of the humanitarian remains the text and the local setting is sort of the context. But also he emphasizes the role of culture as communication. And I think communication is something we could have talked much more about regarding the dynamics of humanitarian negotiations and understandings of ethics in terms of values and beliefs. But I'd like to give the word back to Christina, and we're coming towards the end.
Yes, thank you, Christopher. I don't know how to end here because I feel it's just the starting of a conversation. What I find very interesting here is that, there is a general, I think, from our discussion shows there is this understanding that we can understand culture, use the frame, or it applies to exactly these different identities or entities that we look at, yeah? It may be the national context, may be the professional context, the organizational context. So it is a lens that shows us that, and apparently it's quite important of how we act, and also how we, Paul has said it earlier, how we perceive of each other, right? And that is something that also Solagna and I, we were discussing a lot, the way we are framed also in these cultural terms, how we perceive of the other, how we expect certain behaviors and practices. So, it seems to be a very important lens to understand all that is involved in humanitarian action in general, but also in humanitarian negotiations, right? And I think what we also saw is exactly this, what we said at the beginning, that there is this more practical level, Ashley, that you also pointed out again, like the skill set, how to navigate that, right? This cross-cultural skills we need in humanitarian negotiations, that maybe there needs to be more guidance in that, right? But also on the other level of clashes of norms, and different habits and practices in order to understand. And that's not only with the counterparts, but that may also be within organizations, between organizations, when you think about collective action problems, there might be different understandings of that. And one point I want to mention again, what I found very interesting that came out, and that should be also mentioned again, it's also dynamic, right? So there are changes. Andrew, what you were talking about, and I think also Nigel in a comment in the chat were referring to, there's almost like a generational changes and cultures. How is it changing? But this dynamic aspect of culture is something that, of course, also has to be taken into account. And I think also the Afghanistan case, you showed that. I mean, Ashley, you said how digitalization, how different media and all that is also having impacts on it, right? Let's see how AI and all of that and the use of that for negotiations is a big topic as well, impacts on this. Christopher, the others, I invite for the final points here as well.
I know Nigel would like to come in with a very brief comment, and then we'll have to wrap up. So please.
Yeah, sure. Just to also recognise that in governments there are different cultures within different ministries, and the governments are not single entities. So, when I worked in Syria, we had a relationship with the Ministry of Water Supplies, and when you went into the office, there was clearly not much money. And there were basically a whole bunch of engineers who just wanted to fix things. They just wanted the water systems to work, to fix pumps. That was all they cared in. 2 hours later, I was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs being told off for a public report that Oxfam had written, and they really didn't like us. And the whole atmosphere was completely different. So just say there was very different cultures. And I remember back in Afghanistan days, some of the folk at the Ministry of Health just wanted things to work. And so culture, or there's also a culture related to what you're trying to do, like you're within the government side as well as within our side, and that can be a point for connection that can be sought out.
Yeah, that's an excellent place to end on, and also a topic for future research. So thank you all very much for this conversation. Looking very much forward to seeing this continue in various forms, and have a wonderful day on your respective sites. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.